Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank particularly our speakers for coming to share their reminiscences of a very distinguished and special man. Two brief notes. The speakers will speak in alphabetical order, so there was no manipulation going on, and there will be a reception at the end of the event, and I hope you'll all be able to stay. We're here to celebrate the life and distinguished career of Edward Tayler, called by all those who knew him and loved him Ted, and by the Columbia bureaucracy, despite Ted's earnest efforts to convince them otherwise, Edmund Taylor. My friendship with Ted began in 1970, when we both lived in a building on 139th Street, and it remained one of the blessings of my life. Getting to know Ted was not without its complications. One had to master his multi-level ironies as well as his fabled martinis. His ironies, like his martinis, were bone dry and powerful and took some getting used to. Both were delicious, of course, and I rapidly came to require large doses of both for my sanity. Ted, as I think we all recognize, was a miraculous teacher who had the capacity to unravel the richness of demanding texts in a unique way. I never sat in on a class of his, but after nearly 50 years of discussing the great books we taught together in literature humanities, I now publicly confess that I stole shamelessly from his subtle, illuminating insights which he offered freely to his students. But Ted was never happy simply to explicate works of literature. He sought to transform his students' lives, climb into their imaginations, and get them to see and understand and feel what they never had before. His success was demonstrated to me by the endless stream of letters which Ted would pass on to me, sent to him by former students, some of whom may well be sitting here, testifying to the provocative power of his teaching. The letters were so numerous and so effusive, people claiming finally, after 20 or 30 or 40 years of pondering, to have understood what Ted meant about Marvell or King Lear or Milton. Eventually, I would accuse him of having written them himself. The copies of the letters would come to me with his appended comments about how amazing it was that he seemed able to elicit these responses so often. But I suspected that he wasn't amazed in the least. At some level, he expected what he gave his students to continue to ferment within them. It mattered to him, and he was pleased. A little known but significant piece of Ted's career involved his quixotic determination to single-handedly reshape the college's composition requirement. From a conventional, slightly wimpy enterprise utilizing a multitude of essays and short stories, he fashioned an entirely original, austere, intellectually rigorous course that eschewed reading texts altogether. Called Logic and Rhetoric, it embodied his passion for clean prose and clear thinking. Devising, implementing, convincing the faculty of the rightness of his vision, and training its teachers was a staggering task that he undertook all by himself. Needless to say, the probability of finding a distinguished literary scholar willing to commit an immense amount of time and energy to salvaging the writing of freshmen is about the same as stumbling upon a herd of unicorns strolling through Central Park. But for Ted, it was a moral quest, and he devoted himself to it. The course flourished for a number of years, teaching students about writing in ways that they could never have imagined. In the long run, however, it was judged by the faculty to be too demanding for the teachers to teach, and after a number of years was dropped. Ted never forgave the English department for its lack of pedagogic courage in not sustaining it. If Ted was a brilliant teacher, he was an equally brilliant friend. By that, I do not mean a friend who was brilliant, though Ted certainly was that, but someone who elevated friendship itself into a rare and precious art. He was always concerned, always available, always nourishing. Playful and profound, supportive and stern when he had to be, he actually cared about his friends and what they were doing. He insisted that I show him everything I wrote, for example, which he invariably returned in short order, purged of all manner of infelicities, repetitions, and murky logic. I always felt a vast relief when my words passed his prose stress test. I recently found a pile in my papers, a 3-page piece I'd written for no particular reason several years ago about a difficult time I had experienced in a hospital. It had received a classic Tayler, full-bodied, whimsical but deadly serious review, the margins containing 1 ouch, 1 clumsy, 2 cuts, 3 phews, 1 explain, and a variety of substantive interventions, such as his caution regarding one of my observations, "I think you need more or less here." And his objections to the tone of a sentence, I did not, doubtless for reasons too personal, find it comforting. As my account of medical tribulations became grimly detailed, he confessed his own weakness. "I'm having trouble, Michael, rather too much for this little fellow." He conceded with a warning, "Friday, I have a horrible bug. Do not breathe as you read." I'd be doing a disservice to Ted's memory if I didn't emphasize the sheer joy the Lionel Trilling professor took in living in ways that had little to do with the pleasure he took in reading Shakespeare and Milton. He drove for a time an immense red motorcycle, which might well have been, although I'm not sure, a Harley Davidson. He filled 2 sheds at the New Hampshire encampment he would retreat to every summer with his beloved Christina, with wrenches and saws, pliers, screws and nails, and 2x4s, enabling him to lay pipes, construct rafts, build gazebos, and devise fiendishly clever ways to pump water from the lake into a complex bathtub arrangement he had put together. He was a superb handyman. He was also a nifty athlete. Ted was not the least competitive of men, and we would frequently tangle with some ferocity on the squash court. Squash was very much his game, full of angles and subtlety, with a premium on cleverness. Ted was a superior player and generally won. On occasion, however, I would forge into the lead, at which point he would employ his most outrageous but effective technique. "Oh, please," he would moan piteously in a frail voice, "don't kill the little father." Counting on my residual Oedipal guilt to undermine my concentration. It worked more than it should have, and Ted would all too often end up winning. The little father was a prodigious presence in the life of the university and in my life personally. We are all the poorer for his absence.
It was a long time ago, the spring semester of 1967, 52 years ago to be exact. I had just turned 20 and was a sophomore in the college, a good deal less ignorant than I had been as a freshman, but still a know-nothing with just about everything still in front of me. For reasons I can no longer remember, but probably because a fellow student urged me to do it, I signed up for Ted's course on Milton, one of the many poets and writers I still hadn't read. And by that I mean not one single word. It was essentially a course for graduate students, 2 lectures a week, but a limited number of undergraduates were allowed to take it as well, with the added privilege of having a small, intense Friday afternoon seminar. Everyone here knows what I'm about to say next. The course changed my life. I had some remarkable literature professors during my years at Columbia, but not one of them came close to Ted as a teacher. And after a week or 2, I understood that my brain was in the hands of a master pedagogue, and that I wasn't only being taught how to read better, but how to think better. And also, I believe, how to be better. Short, self-possessed, still young, standing erect before us with a burning cigarette as his only prop, delivering his sentences in a clipped, dry, deadpan voice, occasionally pausing to mumble a caustic, witty aside. Ted had an almost military bearing in class. And this general had a plan, a step-by-step strategy to guide us through a series of small epiphanies toward greater and greater clarity about the cosmic implications of Milton's work. So much so that I never forgot any of it. So much so that in 1981-82, 14 or 15 years later, when I wrote my first novel, City of Glass, there are long passages in it about Milton and Paradise Lost that come directly from the things I learned in Ted's course. And because of that book, Ted and I renewed the friendship that had been interrupted after my years at Columbia. And there he was, not long after the book was published, sitting in a room with a bunch of kids in an undergraduate dormitory where I had gone to give a reading. And the two of us going out together afterward to smoke and drink and talk long into the evening. But there's more from the old days, so let me return to the following year, 1967-68, when I took Ted's two-semester seminar on 16th and 17th century poetry, an experience fully as important as the Milton class. And in that year of years, when Columbia exploded at the height of the Vietnam War, Ted stood with us, the students, and in the madhouse of that spring, he gave us the option of attending class or not attending class during the student strike. And I, who was one of the strikers, skipped all my classes but Ted's, which he held outdoors somewhere on campus under a tree, because even if the world was burning all around us, it was essential to go on reading Donne and Herbert, not just because it kept us sane, but because it was essential. Then, years later, long after 1968 and long after the 1980s, I wrote another novel, Invisible, which was published in 2009, some of which is set at Columbia in the 60s. And because the principal character is a student in Ted's 16th and 17th century poetry seminar, and because I mentioned Ted by name in the book, I sent him a copy, after which he wrote me a most extraordinary letter. As most of you know, Ted grew up in Westfield, New Jersey. As a New Jersey boy myself, who had spent the summer when I was 17 working at my aunt and uncle's appliance store in Westfield, Auster's, where, by the way, Ted's family bought their appliances, I used Westfield as the hometown of my protagonist. Not far from the town, there is a body of water called Echo Lake, which was a popular spot in the summer, with lakeside bungalows and cottages. And in my book, the younger brother of the protagonist drowns in the lake when he is 7, an event that has a terrible effect on the family. And when Ted wrote to me after reading the novel, he said, among other things, that he had vivid memories of Echo Lake from his childhood, and this is where the connection becomes uncanny, that he nearly drowned in that lake himself when he was a boy. A last thought. When we were studying the poems of Fulk Greville back in the fall of 1967, Ted told us that Greville had written somewhere, "I write for those on whom the black ox hath trod." Those words have stuck with me ever since. So much so that I've come to think of them as my credo as a writer. I write for those on whom the black ox hath trod. Thank you for that, Ted, and thank you for everything else, too. Thank you.
I took a course with Ted, a shorter version of what Paul just described in the 17th century. This was back in 1962, when I was a sophomore. And I remember being fascinated by Ted and a little baffled. And years later, Diana Trilling, since Ted bore her husband's name in his title, said, "What's he like?" And I said, "He's brilliant, but a little cryptic," which upset her. She didn't go for cryptic. She liked the explicit and emphatic. Anyway, I came back here in 1991 to do the reporting about Lit Hum and CC that eventually became the book Great Books, and in which Ted plays an enormous role. I had two great Lit Hum teachers in my second time around, Jim Shapiro and Ted Tayler. He came in on the first day, and he said mournfully, like a disappointed lover, "We've only got a year together," to the 18-year-olds. And then he put some initials on the board. You're all familiar with this. WASP, DWM, and DGSI. Don't get sucked in. Don't get sucked in by false ideas, he said. You're not here for political reasons. You're here for very selfish reasons. You're here to build a self. You create a self, you don't inherit it. He gave them his opening sheets, handouts with his favorite quotations from Milton and the beginning of Genesis, with God dividing earth and water, dark and light. God is setting up opposites, Ted said, which is something we all do all the time in life. Moral opposites flow from binary opposites. There are people you touch and people you don't touch. Every choice can become an exclusion. How do you escape the binary bind? His injunction all year was think double. When you think you've understood something, try to penetrate its opposite and see if they have any relation to each other. The voice, as you all know, was remarkable in itself. Baritonal in quality, steady, quiet, very penetrating, with little traces of mockery and wit and little expansions of feeling, filling in the spaces between sentences. His gravedigger's baritone, I called it. I recognized the great strength, even pugnacity, tamed and regulated by physical and emotional grace, by intellectual fitness and great good humor. But how do you build a self? By reading the classics and Lit Hum. Think shape, he said to the kids when he started with the Iliad. Think how it's put together, rather than what the characters feel or don't feel. And he taught them to read Homer as composition as large recurring blocks, which are arranged in relation to one another with variation and so on, which in itself is, I think, a fairly, a not unusual way of teaching Homer. But as the students struggled into life with their necessarily fragmentary and half understood sentences, he would pounce on the essence of what they said and then make them, tag them as an expert in that kind of reading or that particular point of view, and then gently play them off against each other. In other words, he built a reading ego in the student. Where there was nothing, he created a reading ego. And he stroked it and challenged it. The coup here was convincing them that a formalist reading of the classics, an analysis of structure and metaphor and symbol and language, which avoided the possibly redundant correct narratives of race, class, and gender. Not that he disallowed them, but he didn't want to be bound by them in every class. He alluded to them, but that was not what his interest was. The coup was that a formalist reading would deliver intimate meanings that would last for the students for the rest of their lives. And you've heard some already. So Odysseus, at the beginning of his epic, suffers, as Homer says, Grief's in the sea-washed island, the navel of all waters. He's entrapped by Calypso, and Calypso, Ted told us, in ancient Greek meant cloak. And one of the meanings of Odysseus in ancient Greek is to make trouble. That he looked up and he said the corollary of that is that the whole damn bunch of you are born for trouble, unless you want to stay buried in the navel of the sea. One of his thematics, that it was recognition, the process of recognition, Aristotelian stuff, surface recognition, and then deeper and deeper, and ignores this. Penelope puts Odysseus through the bed test. You will all have to face the bed test, he said to his students, by which he was not referring to skill, but to identity. And the drama of recognition and self-recognition recurred throughout Lidholm. Elizabeth and Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, Lear and Gloucester near the end of the play, a scene which moved Ted a great deal, and he would expound in tears. He told his 18-year-olds, you have to be willing to be seen as well as to see. Without that, there was no possibility of love. He concluded his section on, going back now, on the Odyssey, like this. You can go back to the amniotic sea, or you can make your surface shiny and bright so no one knows you. Look at you guys, you think you can find unalloyed happiness. Some of you are hermetically sealed. Some of you are terrified that you're going to be found out. Look, I don't know why you can't just have joy, but if you're going to be truly recognized, it has to involve trouble and pain. You can be calypsoed or Odysseused, buried or troubled, which I thought was very strange advice to give the future elitists, the imperialists of the Western hegemon. But it was his way, it was Columbia's way, and it's a good way. Thank you.
There is no way I can begin to capture all the ways Ted Tayler made me the person standing here today. From the Master's Prose Seminar to the dissertation defense, he was there to guide and support as a teacher, a mentor, sometimes a tormentor, and a model for authentic scholarship. And as for so many others here, he was the one who took my writing seriously and forced me to do it better. So I've brought some of Ted's own writing, not his published scholarship, as important as that work is and cannot be distinguished or separated from his great teaching, but I've brought a few examples of his hand, his manuscript, some moments. In the first, from 1980, he writes to my home in Virginia saying I had received the master's degree, and furthermore had been one of the very lucky few in our class of 100 master's students who would be allowed to proceed toward the doctorate. This was a time, and many of you remember, the English department didn't give grades. For coursework, you were reliant on the evaluations of your seminar instructors, your thesis advisors, and a fearsome end-of-year comprehensive exam. On this note, Ted adds one word, good, exclamation point. Behind that one word lies the active intervention on behalf of what was then a 21-year-old callow youth who came here without knowing that Columbia was in the Ivy League. I came because it was New York City and I wanted to stay working in professional theater. That dream was fading as I wrote this thesis, one of my theses for that year, staying up late at night to please Ted, or thinking I would. That's what I was doing. I turned it in on the deadline, and within 24 hours, he gave it back to me and said, "It's good. It can be better." He said to take it away, push another step, prod. And it was better when I resubmitted it several days later, having not slept. It turned out to be really crucial because some other person who taught me didn't put any form of evaluation in my folder. So I had a gap in the record. And Ted was at that point also the director of graduate studies, and he did something unusual. Most decision-making was shrouded in secrecy, and he asked me what had happened and to respond. Somehow, he managed to get me through and going on in those subsequent years, when I saw a good deal more of his hand in the margins. We've heard a little bit already about the poetry seminars. Hand B and Hand C come from that. It was the usual assignment was the same. Read the entire works of Raleigh, Wyatt, Ben Jonson, and tell us the 3 best poems and why. 2 pages or less. It's the hardest work I've ever done. My students worry all the time about word count. I point out this is much, much harder. This one comes from what seemed to me the apt year of 1984, at least when I read the comments. They said things like erg and the things you've heard about. And then we got to my 3rd criterion, I thought my best criterion for poetic excellence. This was in Marvell's poetry. And I got this comment. I suspect that this one conceals your true criteria. The previous 2 are bogus. Designed to insulate you from confronting the implications of the last. Now, there's a lot of red on this. That's my response to his very few and scathing words, which I dropped off at his office the next day because I knew he was very busy and weary teaching, but I had to defend myself somehow. To which I got a second one of those little memos. This one said, "Your points are well taken. Now, note that you are at last thinking where you live, and that no small thing, you have almost defined not your answer, but your dilemma. Very Ben Jonson of you. Congratulations." What frustrated all of us in that class was we kept trying to figure out what he wanted, when what he wanted was us to figure out what we chose. And when we did get nearly there, we'd get the go, now go. He did this for me when I was struggling to finish the dissertation while working full-time in the most unexpected, liberating way, especially given what David just mentioned. He realized before I did that I wanted to be writing not only about form and the relationship between Elizabethan poetry and drama, but about gender. And he gave me license to go in my own, not his, direction. I went, and he supported my going. To explain my final exhibit of Ted's hand, I need quickly to reference my own. Once we were having an English department party on the 6th floor of Philosophy Hall. I was trying to help clean up as the group dwindled. I shoved the trash down, hit broken glass, and began bleeding profusely. Professor Tayler immediately decided we were going to the emergency room and not only walked me down to St. Luke's, but sat with me for hours as we waited for attention. You know, the 1980s was not the regentrified heights. St. Luke's on a Friday night had a lot of worse cases than mine, and some were indeed scary, and I don't think I would have lasted the hours we sat without Ted refusing to leave. It was typical of his kindness, not only as a scholar and a teacher, but as simply a human being. Not that he would have countenanced me being a friend. Not during that decade. He had a strict sense of ritual, and I remained Ms. Henderson, and he was EWT, or Professor Tayler, until the day of my doctoral hooding, when for the first time I got a short note saying, "Congratulations, signed, Ted." It took several years for me to adjust, not to just being a student, but being a colleague. And so the last inscription, much later, from the volume The Wit to Know, Essays on English Renaissance Literature for Edward Tayler, to which I was honored to contribute. At the celebration of this in Amherst, Ted wrote in my copy, 14 October 00, for my friend, Diana, her St. Luke's companion. I read that Ted died of heart failure, but I simply can't believe that. I can believe he left the world on the day that Shakespeare died. I can believe I'm even standing in a neoclassical rotunda on the Ides of March giving a public speech in praise of him, but I do not believe his heart could ever fail. So, with that, mine will. I want to end by saying the Ted Tayler I knew never had a heart failure, and I raise my imaginary martini glass to the man whose hand remains with me, and to the community of more than a little winter love in a dark corner that he has helped create. Rest in soft peace, Ted, and thank you.
Diana and I were graduate students together, and she remembers everything. I don't. I left the Midwestern provincial boons and arrived at Columbia in 1978, back when nearly all the professors were men, and so were most of the graduate students. And the neighborhood was rough and tough and ugly. I was dead set on a new life for my mind. I came lusting after fiery debate, brilliant dialogue, and new ideas to crack my head open and turn me upside down. This I remember. But great swaths of my experience in graduate school have been gulped down the maw of time. The names of classes, professors, and other students. Philosophy Hall remains vivid. It smells, the sound of footsteps, tea in the afternoon, my defense. I tell you this by way of apology. You are listening to a woman with a memory in which fog floats. Actually, walking up the steps, coming here, I wondered if I was more traumatized by the transition from Minnesota to New York than I knew. I don't remember the other students in Professor Edward Taylor's graduate seminar, except Hal Foster, someone I still know, now an art critic, who made his abstruse comments in a voice just above a whisper, which impressed me terribly because it forced the rest of us to lean forward in order to hear him. And I believe he mentioned Derrida regularly, which also impressed me because at the time, I couldn't make head or tail of grammatology. What I do remember is the way our professor articulated the rigorous proceedings of his excellent mind. I usually seated myself close enough to him at the table so I could see his mouth move and follow exactly what he was saying. Every step, jump, and turn, if possible. He put more pressure on a text than anyone I had ever known before then. and he appeared to love the secrets he unleashed from a line or sentence. He liked to keep us on guard and then push us if we failed to anticipate the next link in the chain of his reasoning, tantalizingly present, but not always fully visible until he pulled out a partial or apparently complete conclusion with a verbal flourish and laid it out in front of us. A triumphant smile on his face, usually undercut by irony detectable in his eyes. I do remember his brilliant flights about nothing in Lear, but I cannot rehearse it. Memory, however, is consolidated by emotion, and I know that what moved me most about Professor Tayler was the how, not the what. Years later, we met again, Ted, Christina, my husband Paul, and I, for a couple of extremely pleasurable and lively dinners. By then, my intellectual travels had taken me far afield into neurobiology, psychiatry, phenomenology, and even analytical philosophy and symbolic logic. The latter two I never thought I would be able to stomach, but life is surprising. And Professor Tayler, who had become Ted, impressed me in exactly the same way he had decades earlier. But I had an additional insight. He was indefatigably curious, interested, persistent, and unafraid when it came to ideas. Paul told me after one of those dinners that Ted had said this about my young self. I remember how intensely Siri listened. This wasn't true of every class, I can tell you that. I have memories of pompous droning, too, and the peevish, insurrectionist thoughts I directed at those professorial droners. I listened hard to Ted Tayler because I felt in him what I wanted for myself. The pleasures of synthetic knowledge, the dance made possible by hard-won thought. What I took with me out the door was an example of a probing, exacting, vibrant mind in motion. Thanks.
I'm reading this off a screen, not because I'm green or anything, my printer broke. At the beginning of my junior year at Columbia College, I abandoned medieval studies. It had been a long time coming, giving up on my plans to become a medievalist for all sorts of reasons, but the immediate catalyst that September was needing to make room in my full course load for a Renaissance writer. I wanted to take Professor Edward Taylor's 2-semester Shakespeare class. I still have my notebook from his Shakespeare class. It's the only notebook I saved from my 4 years at Columbia, even though I studied with some truly remarkable scholars and teachers, a number of them medievalists, and I'm profoundly indebted to what they taught me. But even while taking his class, I found myself compulsively drawn to read and reread my notes from Professor Taylor's lectures, not because I was a diligent student, I wasn't, but because I felt the need to revisit what Professor Taylor had said out from under the overwhelming spell of his classroom performance. The blue jeans, the leather jacket, the tousled hair. He can't have always dressed like that, but I can't remember any other clothes he wore, except once I saw him in a Speedo at the gym, which I found horribly confusing. Maybe I dreamed that I had a huge crush on him. And the cigarette. the book of matches and the Bic lighter, the squinting at the smoke from the cigarette and the matches, and the intricate construction of his lectures, half read, half apparently improvised, delivered mostly in a deadpan method actor's mumble that was always perfectly audible and capable of a stunning range of feelings. And the dizzying shifts from rigorous, arduous, serious analysis to anecdote to aphorism to low comedy with a limberness Shakespeare would have envied. I visited Professor Taylor's office in Philosophy Hall only once to talk about my paper on something or other in The Tempest, and as I recall, we spent most of the time talking about the singing duo Sam and Dave, of whom I'd never heard. That's what I remember of the visit anyway. I was, by that time, so completely in awe of him, so nervous about actually speaking to him directly, that my memory of that half hour is blurry. I remember feeling a little surprised that he too seemed nervous or shy. I began the habit of revisiting my notes from Professor Taylor's lectures because I needed time to consider what he'd taught me. As he said of the experience provided by Hamlet, the notes allowed contemplation of contradiction in suspension. I needed to go back to what I'd written to try to analyze what was happening to me lecture after lecture, during which and immediately after which I often felt my head or my heart or both were going to explode. That sounds awfully swoony, but I'm not exaggerating. I almost fainted once walking away from room 517 in Hamilton Hall. It was October 18th, 1976, and Taylor had just finished with Romeo and Juliet and was transitioning via Plato, Aristotle, empiricism, and nominalism to his mind-blowing examination of Richard II. I was top-heavy with dialectical spin, shadows and substances, love and death, illusion and reality, and I felt the axis of the world as I'd understood it before entering Taylor's classroom shifting, literally shifting under my feet. To return again to Professor Taylor on Hamlet, for me this was certainly true of his lectures as well. Through it, he said, we can contemplate more truth than the mind should be able to bear. One thing that distinguishes the notes I took in Professor Taylor's class is that I took great pains to write down what he said exactly as he said it. I made note of his pauses, as for instance when he was talking about Henry IV. He said, in Henry IV, the entire movement of the play is reverberated in a single line. I do, I will. In between I do and I will, there's a knock at the door. That's the knock of the everyday. Here, Taylor took a long pause, which I wrote in my notebook, during which he probably relit his cigarette, then added under his breath, incredible. I made note of his ear for which words to emphasize. After he quoted Coleridge's observation that Shakespeare differs from other dramatists in his use of expectation in preference to surprise, Professor Taylor added, by way of illustration, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Then he looked at us and said, it's not God said, let there be light, and there was light. And I made note of his theatricality, which sometimes consisted of preferring surprise to expectation. Once he said, hubris in Aristotle is mistranslated. Hubris is generally used to describe a tragic character flaw. The word really means any sort of outrage. Hubris is more a matter of nemesis. They say Agamemnon's hubris is the sin of pride. Bullshit. He killed his daughter. He was chopped to bits with an axe. Maybe I took such careful notes because Professor Taylor hadn't written a book about Shakespeare, and he warned us that he probably wouldn't. He said, there's the kind of scholar who goes into the parish church in Stratford-on-Avon and comes out with a previously undiscovered legal document of John Shakespeare's, and then there's the kind of scholar who can't find the parish church. Or maybe I was precise in writing down what he said because though I didn't know it at the time, it's an exercise to train playwrights, that kind of precision, and though I didn't know it at the time, I was on my way to becoming a playwright. Professor Taylor's two-semester reading of Shakespeare formed a new understanding for me of the meaning and purpose of plays, of theater, of art itself, what theater is and what plays are, that has been and remains central to everything I've done in the theater. I just pulled from the notebook a few examples, things that he said, polarities, shadows and substance, light and dark, dream and waking. These are the essences of all theater. Theater deals with nothing less or more. Our freedom in theater stems from the fact that we are not in the arena yet. Lear uniquely exploits the psychic condition of the theater itself, to do and not to do. He exploits our condition as spectators at a play. Language makes us say what we do not want to say, or it prevents us from speaking what we desperately want to say. Shakespeare doesn't want the audience to be comfortable. He wants us to confront paradox. All developments in Shakespeare lead to the ability to count to two. And this morning, as I was looking back through the notebook, I came across this, which seems sort of prescient, given our current circumstances. Professor Tayler said, Richard III is not the victim of a birth defect. He is a series of changing histrionic roles at the center of which lies evil. He is, first of all, an actor. We share his awareness of this. He stands half between art and life. He is tied to us by intimacy, rejected by his villainy. Richard makes us feel that the illusory is favorable to the real. This is the intention of all drama and theater. And if he was speaking in 2019, he might have added also its danger. I remember Professor Tayler seeming to age over the 2 semesters as he proceeded through the histories and comedies, past Measure for Measure to Othello, and into the tragedies, which paradoxically we investigated as spring arrived. While lecturing on Antony and Cleopatra, he looked up at us and said, if you people were Egyptians and not Romans, you'd all be outside right now, lying on the grass. Lear threatened to undo him. Before confronting the terrible end of the play, I have a vivid memory of his face drawn and lined, his eyes remote with sorrow as he asked us to consider, in what sort of universe does wasteful death follow so much suffering and torture? I don't recall speaking in class. I don't really recall anyone but him speaking, though I'm sure that's not the case. I never made contact with Professor Tayler after the class ended. I regret that. He professed a certain disdain for most theater production. One thing he said, it's become a mantra of sorts for me to mutter to myself in the dark in previews. Actors are capable of 3 things: making the bad appear mediocre, making the good appear mediocre, and making the mediocre appear to be what it is. I wish I'd been bolder or less concerned about preserving in its pristine state the hugely important memory of that life and soul-altering class. I wish I told Professor Tayler how entirely in his debt I am. I'm hugely grateful to Professor Taylor's family for including me in this day of remembrance and giving me the chance to say to you and at Columbia and to Edward Taylor's vast shadow, if not his substance, thank you.
Blood is